All right. Let's start with a quote. Einstein was brilliant because he recognized both the scientific process as being not too separate from the intuitive process. There is no logical way to the discovery of these elemental laws. There is only the way of intuition, which is helped by a feeling for the order lying behind the appearance. Let's talk a little bit about the mystery schools, because the Tarot comes to us in part through the Western mystery schools. And these go back as far as Egypt. The Egyptians believed that in order to separate humans from the beast, all the arts and sciences, including but not limited to language, writing, agriculture, astrology, alchemy, and ritual, was given to mankind by their god Thoth. When the Greeks conquered Egypt in 332 BC, they began the long process of absorbing Egyptian culture and learning. The Greeks syncretized the Egyptian deity Thoth with their god Hermes, known in Latin as Mercury. We spoke last week about the Tarot sometimes being called the Book of Thoth, because it's believed in Hermeticism to have come out of that tradition. Thoth, the giver of learning, became HermesTrismegistus, or three greatest Hermes. The body of knowledge he bequeathed to mankind, which included alchemy, astrology, and magic, are called the Hermetic sciences in his honor. Now, the wealthy classes of the Greek world sent their sons to be educated in the Hermetic mystery schools, much as in the first half of the previous century and in the 18th century, the upper classes in the U.S. would send their children over to Europe to be educated after getting through high school or through university. And that, in the second half of the last century, that translated over to, in families of means, oftentimes, at least where I grew up, though not in my family, that children would be sent to Europe on a vacation upon completion of high school. So the Greeks, on the other hand, sent their kids to Egypt, primarily Alexandria, Egypt. All right. In the late 18th century, a manuscript was being circulated in Europe that was attributed to Iamblichus, the 3rd century Neoplatonic philosopher. It described in detail the ritual of Egyptian initiation. In the 19th century, it was translated into French by Paul Christian, and in the Sacred Tarot, C.C. Zane uses Genevieve Stebbins' English translation, which describes the 22 major arcanum of the Tarot as icons on the steps of initiation. Now, it was believed that between the paws of the Great Sphinx at Giza, there was an entrance into subterranean temples. Well, the doorway has not been found, and the initiation chambers have not been found, but friends who, in the last year, who were traveling in Egypt with an archaeologist spoke to him about this, and he said that, yes, certain, I forget what the testing methods are they use, whether it's sonar or infrared or whatever, but they have detected that there are hidden chambers down there that have yet to be opened or explored, at least in the modern era. So, ManlyPHall, Secret Teachings of All Ages, says, candidates aspiring to membership in the religious orders underwent severe tests to prove their worthiness. These ordeals were called initiations. Those who passed them successfully were welcomed as brothers by the priest and were instructed in the secret teachings. Among the ancients, philosophy, science, and religion were never considered as separate units. Each was regarded as an integral part of the whole. Philosophy was scientific and religious. Science was philosophic and religious. Religion was philosophic and scientific. Perfect wisdom was considered unattainable save as the result of harmonizing all three of these expressions of mental and moral activity. Mirroring that sentiment is Einstein again. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. So, at the core of the Brotherhood of Light Mystery School tradition is the Hermetic creation story, which is called the cycle of necessity. And it describes the soul's journey into matter with the dual purpose, to grow in love and wisdom, or you might describe it as compassion and knowledge. The ultimate goal of Hermeticism is self-conscious immortality, to be self-aware in a state of mystical union with the divine. The cycle of necessity describes the soul's involution into matter and its evolution back to spirit. The ego, or spark of divinity in us all, is born to angelic parents in the highest level of the spiritual realms. Around the ego, twin souls develop, which are impelled on a cyclic journey in order to develop the characteristic skills and abilities that allow them to fulfill their role in the divine plan. Consciousness, life, is everywhere present. It differs only by degree. So here's an illustration. Celestial realms, the souls differentiate, descend through spiritual, astral, down to physical. And in Hermeticism, it's believes in what may be called transmigration of the soul, which is not necessarily reincarnation as it's known in the East. In the Pythagorean sense, the soul evolves first into mineral form, up through varying levels of vegetable, animal, to human form before returning again into astral, spiritual, and ultimately celestial realms. And it gains in each of those realms a different type of experience, but it's only in form, in the physical, having those experiences in the physical form that it gains love and wisdom. All right. All right. It's often described as Jacob's ladder. And we've covered this. Saint says, because there is no conceivable way by which the soul can acquire love and wisdom except through the varied experiences in form, the cycle through which the soul passes from spirit to matter and from matter back to spirit, living in countless forms in each of the three realms, is called by initiates the cycle of necessity. That is, this cycle of experiences in various forms is a necessity if the soul is to acquire the love and wisdom which alone make possible self-conscious immortality. So, initiation mimics the cycle of necessity. And the major arcanum of the tarot represent the various stages in the process of initiation, which has to do with trials, tribulations, overcoming them, meeting one's mentors, etc., which are pictured in that path from the fool all the way up to the adept. So the question is, why should we develop intuition? And each one of us is on a journey to ultimately discover our place in God's great plan. Intuition holds the answer. Intuition provides clearer perceptions of the world and our role in it. In this life, we need our intuitive soul senses to live more fully. Foreknowledge of the future can have great practical value and contribute not only to our survival, but to our thriving. Now, keep in mind that intuition offers not just the ability to avoid painful life experiences, but it also offers the ability to see the ultimate effect of these experiences on our character or soul. Developed intuition integrates our physical and spiritual selves, and we can achieve a more conscious transition upon death if our soul senses are fully active while on the physical plane. So these are a few good reasons to develop your intuition. In the Brotherhood of Light, we have a 9-point plan. And we have what are called 4 freedoms and 4 facts. So, the facts about astrology, extrasensory perception, induced emotion, and directed thinking help us to gain freedom. Well, that should be freedom from want, not freedom from wands. And freedom from fear, as well as freedom of expression and freedom of worship. Intuition can be useful in bringing about freedom from want, is if we can accurately listen to and follow our intuitions. We won't necessarily get the winning lottery numbers for the 400 million jackpot, but we might be guided into some area of right livelihood through which we can enjoy what we're doing and provide for ourselves. The advantage of developing ESP also is in terms of freedom of worship, is that the individual can have their own experience or their own relationship with the divine rather than having to have that interpreted for them through religious hierarchy. So, some myths about intuition. You must be born with the gift. So, just as in any other area of skill, gifted persons have distinct advantages. However, everyone can learn to develop their intuition. Just as you have physical senses, as we discussed in the first class, everyone also has corresponding psychic senses. But we all know people who may have pronounced sense of smell. So much so they might work as parfumiers, or there's persons who have a pronounced sense of color, who may take up some occupation dealing with art or design. So each one of us has physical senses that may be more pronounced than others. We all have all of the psychic senses, but they may lie in varying degrees of dormancy, and we have to just awaken them. There are other people who may have them naturally awake, and because of that, they can be experts in that area because it comes so naturally to them. Another myth is one should never accept money for their intuitive gifts, that it would be unspiritual to do so. However, the reality is that intuition is a skill like any other skill, and most intuitives work as therapists do, in working with people to resolve issues and to do problem solving. So all persons deserve the right to a decent livelihood, especially those persons who spend their lives helping others. All right. Have you ever lived with a child, sibling, roommate, or partner who was just learning to play an instrument? Some of you have had this experience. The most beautiful music can be made unbeautiful in the hands of an untuned instrument. It's the same with intuitive work. You must continually fine-tune your instrument. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to refine our abilities. To do that, we have to develop the practice of cultivating clarity. And the way we do this is through practicing self-improvement and self-realization. Any techniques which allow us to cut through the chatter of our minds and the world chaos that surrounds us. We must continually refine our characters in order to be good conduits for intuitive insights. I believe it was Buddha who said, wherever I go, there I am. So, we take ourselves with us, and we take the chatter of what some people describe as the monkey mind with us wherever we go. To be a good intuitive instrument, you have to continually work on refining those aspects of personal character that are blockages for you. So psychic development involves an ever-increasing connectedness to all of life. It is difficult to view the world through dirty windows. Therefore, we must continue to refine our dross in the form of egotism, self-righteous opinions, personal hurts, addictions, anger, selfishness, etc. Alchemy, both mental, spiritual, and personal, offer the best tools for this refinement. In order to unlock intuition, one must learn to shift their mental and emotional gears. We do this when I did the sample reading at the beginning of class. You saw that I was shuffling and cutting cards. And what that is it is a ritual. It's simple. There weren't any, bells and smells with this ritual, but it can be done. You can have music playing. You can make it as ritualistic as you want. But the process of shuffling and cutting and treating the cards with respect creates a ritualistic state of mind. And what ritual does is it really works to dial one's consciousness into higher states. So even for persons who are not consciously doing their inner work, one can, when you sit down to do a reading, go into a state which can allow clarity. So what do? We have to first work at creating an environment and a mood that is conducive to inner work. I described last week, again, using the table to read on that you may argue with your spouse or children over dinner isn't necessarily going to give you the best readings. Some people, and we have one down in the basement below, we have a prepared white pine panel which is used for doing readings on. You may have seen when I pulled out my cards that I have them wrapped in a silk scarf. This one's a little bit ancient and worn, but nevertheless, silk is a non-conductive material, and electricity and other vibrations don't pass through it. Laura was complaining on Sunday that in her silk shirt that there was even difficulties with air passing through it. So she said it didn't breathe. And so what I do is I lay a silk down on any surface that I'm going to read on, and I place the cards on that because the cards as a divinatory instrument are receptive, and they pick up on the character vibrations of the environment. Next, what we have to do is cultivate objectivity and a strong desire to receive the truth. I did that after receiving Marie's question about going to Florida. I sat there, and as I shuffled and cut the cards, I was focusing on receiving a truthful answer. I also always ask to give the information in a way that's for the highest good of all involved. Now, that is harder to do than you would imagine, because not only when you do a reading do you have to cultivate clarity and objectivity. Subjectivity stands in the way of doing a good reading, which is why I find it vastly easier to read for strangers and people I've never met than for friends and family members, even though I do it for all of the above. The reason with friends and family members is I have a subjective vision of their life, either what I want for them or what I already know about them and what's possible. And so oftentimes that can work as filters. But again, you're asking for the highest good of all involved. The other thing to know is if you start doing this somewhat regularly, there's a very good chance that you will draw into your sphere distressed people. Persons who have everything working well for them don't always seek out readings. Persons who are having problems and that are not getting the answers from their physician, their counselor, their rabbi, their minister, their best friend, whatever the usual suspects are for them to get relief, may end up coming to you. Yes, Barb?
Question: how can one cleanse or clear the cards?
That is a good question. Let me finish what I was talking about, and then I will switch to that subject. So you may have to ask that again or raise your hand again in case I forget. So what is taking place is everyone that comes to you has their own set of filters on. It's much like screen doors with different diameter mesh in terms of what can get through and what can't. And what I have found is that persons who have suffered from prolonged depression can sometimes be the hardest to read for. The reason for that is our mind is like Velcro, and it latches onto those sizes or shapes or objects or colors that most neatly mirror its states. And what I've found with people suffering from chronic depression is you can do a reading and they will summarize it at the end with what may be the one negative thought that was expressed. and they will hold on to that and obsess on that for some time afterwards, and even come back to you with it. So that can be a problem. You can't always be responsible for the other person's state, but you have to be somewhat good at being able to detect that and also determine what information somebody will be able to handle at any given time. All right, I love this from the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu says, "We mold clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that makes the vessel useful." So when we go to do readings, we have to pour out our subjectivity, and we have to remain open with some type of emptiness. This is why in the Magus, in the Brotherhood of Light deck, the Magus is seen holding a scepter that has an open sphere at the top, which represents that receptivity to higher knowledge. And Barb, you may want to push that door shut. We're starting to get little bugs in here attracted to the light. Go to the light. Probably if the door is closed, I can feel that the air is on. Are you feeling it over here? Yeah, it is. It is on. So that's a good sign compared to last week. All right. I think 2 degrees cooler would be just perfect. Thank you. Now I'll go back to that question. Let me just finish this. And in preparing to do a reading, there is a dynamic tension between the desire to know and the receptiveness of the mind. This is what goes on in that split second when we're projecting our consciousness. Oh, I forgot the question. You'll have to remind me, Barb. Thank you. How to clear the cards. All right, there are different ways to do that. If you inherit a deck from someone or pick one up at a garage sale, you don't know who the owner is. Chances are if you know the owner and are inheriting a deck from someone, it could be from somebody you like or love, and you may feel that the vibrations in the cards are harmonious with you. If it's from an unknown source, or when I first started doing card readings, probably for the first 10 years, I would experiment. I would alternate between myself shuffling and cutting the cards for the reading and letting the querent shuffle and cut the cards. In the last 30 years, I have only shuffled and cut the cards myself, not letting the querent handle the cards. And the reason for that is I'm the one getting the information and bringing it through my higher self. And what I found is not everyone, has spent their time as a card dealer in Vegas. And you put an unusually sized deck into some people's hands, even 78 cards rather than 52, and they're actually struggling with the process. And that struggle could come across in the reading itself. It could pick up on that character vibration. So that's what I've decided on. It doesn't mean that the rest of you will decide on that. You may shuffle and let the other person cut the cards into 3 piles. It's truly a personal process. The thing is discovering how do you get the best results. That's my ultimate goal. So to clear it, if somebody else was handling the deck, what I would oftentimes do is after the reading was over and if there was some time, I would sit and shuffle and cut the cards myself and move the energy out. It's also when you're first starting to read cards, it's a very good exercise to get your deck of cards, especially if it's one of these brand new decks that is slippery and hard. You want to break them in. And part of that process is just taking a few minutes each day to shuffle and cut your cards while at the same time visualizing force moving down through your arms and hands and into the cards as you're shuffling them, because you're also building up that process of psychokinesis to where the energy passes down through you, from your soul through your body into the shuffling process. Other things that could be done. A deck can be spread out in the sunlight for a period of time. Or on a night like tonight where you have a full moon, you might want to spread it out in the moonlight, providing there isn't a wind. Otherwise, you could spend the next day running around your yard trying to find your cards. But there are different ways to clear it out. In certain ethnicities, especially in the Latin American community, a cologne called agua de Florida is used, Florida water, which can be rubbed into the hands and put on the cards, or you might have an essential oil that you really like that has a cleansing vibration, that you might want to put some drops of that in the box in which you keep your cards. So there's different things that can be done to cleanse them. Do not put them in the washing machine. Laundering. Yes, you can use, white sage or cedar or frankincense or some other desirable scent and pass the cards through smoke. That's another way to do it. So those are the traditional ways. Oftentimes, if you were cleansing a crystal or a piece of jewelry, it might be buried in a bowl of salt for a period of time. But if you put a paper object into salt, it will react with the chemistry of the paper and over time start to break the paper down. So salt works fine with metals and crystals, which are inorganic matters, but with anything that's an organic matter, salt tends to have an antipathy for that. In fact, when the Romans destroyed Carthage, they sowed salt into the fields because living things cannot survive in that environment. Did that answer the question? I think it did.
You can also do it with your intention. When you're shuffling, I do let people handle their own cards and I ask them to shuffle them gently and love them up. And so I'm suggesting their intention, but I also make sure that I shuffle the cards between each reading.
Right.
And I like that my cards have gotten richer and richer over the years with other people's loving them up and
That's
being
great.
part of the process.
Yeah, every reader has a different technique they work with, and you just each have to find what's going to get you the best results, and that's a personal exploratory process.
I also find it fascinating to watch people as they shuffle. It tells me a lot about them. How intuitive they are, what kind of a vibration they're bringing to the table. It's really helpful to me.
Right. I mean, there may be different levels of information that come through that process. All right. So what do? An intuitive counselor must offer encouragement, support, clear insights, and coping strategies. Help the client to understand why something is happening and what the gifts are to be gained through having the experience. The intuitive counselor will often be asked to help resolve life's greatest difficulties, which are disease, suffering, loss, hardship, and sorrow. So, let's see. All right. Everybody just sit, and those of you who are watching online, just sit and close your eyes and listen to my voice. We're going to do a little exercise, and I'd like you to remember a time that you had a very difficult life experience. Perhaps this may have been the loss of a loved one, a physical injury, medical emergency, totaling your car, a loss of job, breakup of a significant relationship, betrayal by a friend, or losing your home. Normally, I would have you write what you remember about that event, but just run it over in your mind and know that you can write this down at a later time. Think about what was painful or upsetting about this experience. And now think, how did you grow as a result of this experience? Was there any gift from this experience that positively shaped who you are today? And come back into the room. Does anyone have a story to share? If not, that's okay. What came to my mind in this process was almost 30 years ago, 28 years ago, I had lived for 10 years in a wonderful old turn-of-the-century house that was 3 blocks from the ocean in Santa Monica, where I grew up. And it had, during that decade, gone from being kind of a bohemian enclave by the sea to becoming a very highly desirable location for young professionals, wanting to be by the ocean. And this was, at the time, it was protected under rent control. And it was an old craftsman house that had, from 1916, that had been broken down from one house into 3 apartments. And so during what happened was the owner, who was also an attorney, figured out a loophole around the rent control laws that if it was to be owner-occupied, the owner could move in and then lift the rents for all the other properties. Now, this was around 1989 when this happened, and I think I was paying $425 for a wonderful apartment 3 blocks from the ocean. So there was the neighborhood I grew up in. I had always known people in that house. I had friends throughout the environment, and I really didn't want to leave. I mean, I was white-knuckled gripping onto that place. But I decided to let go. And if I hadn't, I would probably still be living there now and would have missed out on all of the other life experiences I've had. So in a sense, being forced, being pried like a barnacle off my rock was absolutely painful when it happened. But the end result is I went on to enjoy the rest of my life and have a series of other great homes and great experiences. So the reason we're doing this exercise is that it's important to go back and remember that oftentimes things that look really bad to us while they're taking place are actually gifts. They're only painful in the moment because we're being forced to change in some way that we had not planned for ourselves. And that's something, as a reader, you might have to be able to discover when you're doing a reading for others. You may not always see what the gift is that comes from that, but In the mythology of Pandora's box, the god Zeus sent this down to Earth. It was really a jar, but we call it a box. And it was packed full of all of the evils you could imagine. I mean, there were mosquitoes in there. And any other, buzzing, annoying thing in life was included in there. And she was told not to open it. But the curiosity of humans is such that, when told not to do something, she opened it and she released into the world all of the ills of the world. And at the end of that, there was only one creature. I think the name was Elpis, remaining in the bottom of the box, which is hope. So, our goal in giving readings for others is not to instill a false hope, but to really be able to look at any situation in life from the perspective that even the darkest cloud has a silver lining. It's just a matter of finding that, finding the gift in the garbage. So let's continue on where we left off last week with the major arcanum. And we're going to look at the next 11, or the next 10 arcanum tonight. I believe we looked at 12. No, we looked at 10 last week. We've got 11 more. This is the Enchantress, which is sometimes called Courage, and in other decks it's called Strength. And we can see that strength is implied because we have here a woman who is opening and closing the jaws of a lion. Don't try this at home. Unless you were raised in a circus. So this can represent strength of different types. It can be strength of character. It represents the creative powers of imagination. Charisma. This is a type of strength that certain people emanate, by which they may influence us to do their will. Depending on the motive of the individual, it could be for our good or our detriment. But it's that type of magnetism or charisma that she has over this lower animal form. It's a card that can represent feeling, extrasensory perception, and the process of intuition. Magical powers. Awakening to the interconnectedness of everyone and everything. It can represent force or spiritual power, one's mystical inner awareness, and raising our animal instincts to spiritual level. I've recently been spending my mornings reading a book called The Biology of Transcendence, which is a fascinating book. Joseph Chilton Pearce is the author. And he's done a lot of research, and he quotes other researchers in the area of neuroscience, etc. And there are standard ideas that our brain evolves in utero, just as it has evolved over history. That first, what they call the reptilian brain forms, and then the old mammalian brain, followed by the new mammalian brain, and lastly, after birth, the frontal cortex develops. which each are successive stages in our soul's evolution when we talk about moving from mineral up to mankind. And so when we talk about raising the animal instincts, as humans, we're still mammals. And then we have the thraldom of all inherited history that we carry about through our experiences with all different forms. And so our evolution is this continued process of raising our vibratory rate. Now, from the astrological perspective, Arcanum 11 corresponds to the planet Neptune, which is idealistic, visionary, imaginative, mystical, empathetic, telepathic. These are all qualities to represent Neptune. The powers of the imagination and the powers of Neptune are also such that my mentor, Jesse Montoya, used to call this the 10% card. And he said that the nature of Neptune is to, promise you the world, but you get 10% of what's promised. So what we have to be careful of when this card comes up is that our expectations are not being exaggerated somehow, or the things that are being promised to us, that somebody isn't doing a con game or pulling the wool over our eyes. It can represent all of these, mystical, intuitive, magical qualities, and at the same time, the amazing thing about imagination is, for many, reality doesn't match up to what we can create in our minds, in our fantasy thinking. Yes, Barbara.
This is the biology of
Transcendence by Joseph Chilton Pearce. The other book I'm reading in conjunction with that is called The Master and the Emissary, and I forget the author on that, but it discusses the scientific understandings that are known about right brain, left brain activity. And I'll tell you more about that when I've gotten through it. So here is a quote from Joseph Conrad. "Only in men's imagination does every truth find an effective and undeniable existence. Imagination, not invention, is the supreme master of art as of life." Good quote for Arcanum 11. So let's take a look at some different images. We've already viewed this. It's a woman very simply dressed, so it's a feminine quality, though she's standing, so she is active. Opens and closes the jaws of a lion, which shows this power or mastery over more animalistic forms, or what could be a telepathy or charisma, or on the negative side, a conning energy. There is a vase at her crown, and it looks like two eagles or hawks, which represent things which have taken flight. Neptune we consider in Hermetic astrology to be the upper octave expression of Venus, the planet of love. So the vase represents the emotions that have been elevated to a higher level. So Venus governs a physical or conjugal love, whereas the love of Neptune is the type of love that we feel in universal brotherhood, or when we sense our interconnectedness to the rest of life. Here, this is from an old woodblock deck. This is called Strength. I believe that's a lion, but it could be any beastie beast from the looks of it here. And the angle on this is interesting, the way in which she's opening and closing its jaws. From a Swiss deck, it's again called Strength or Force. And what's interesting here is it looks more like Samson. It's a man with a cudgel who is truly wrangling this wild beast.
But he's put his club down.
He has put his club down. So it's not physical force that gives one the strength or mastery. It's a spiritual force.
They're doing their dance.
They are. They're doing a great dance. And then this wonderful Egyptian-styled deck. And here you can see they attribute the qualities of Mars to this card, which are more of a physical strength than anything else. But again, we're back to a woman, and we can see the theme over here. Her hat looks like a figure eight, and here the figure eight has been drawn above this watercolor image. So all are implying, woman or man over beast, which is a perpetual struggle in these different divisions in the brain, the very ancient animalistic parts of our nature which are completely dependent on for our survival. We evolved through a world, and you can see this in any nature film you ever watch. What's going on? Everyone is eating. And everyone is eating someone else. That is what our experience with form is about in so many of the incarnations.
It's interesting because the eating habits in the pride of lions do not do anything to help the next guy, even the little kids or the wounded ones, get anything to eat. Everybody's out for themselves to get their food. So it really is the strength. The powerful ones survive, and those that can't cope for themselves fall by the wayside.
That is part of, Darwin's understanding of survival of the fittest. Brute force.
Learn about the lion, because
Yeah.
that should be part of what the lion represents, and part of what we're transcending when we apply our human energy, our altruism, and caring to the animal nature.
Centered animal nature. All right, this is called the martyr, the hanging man, the hanged man, and in every other language it's called the same. I think in some it's called les perdus, or the lost. But it's pretty much the concept is the same. And what we see is a man here between two trees. Their branches have been cut. In this deck, there were 6 branches on each tree, totally 12, representing each of the 12 houses of a chart or each of the 12 signs of the zodiac. The grapes growing here, using these trees as their supports, are dripping their vital forces. This man is hung not by his neck, but by his foot. And his body symbolism, we can see a cross is formed, which is matter. And we talked in the beginning class about geometric symbolism. Here we have a triangle pointing down towards Earth. So material energy has been put in a direction where it's being dissipated or lost. From his hands fall pieces of silver. So this card definitely represents, to some degree, possibly sacrifice, loss, sorrow, hardship, martyrdom. On the positive note, this card can represent sacrifice for the higher good. And the only way society has advanced from that previous bestial level that Laura described as every lion out for himself or herself, has been through individuals making sacrifice. Most recently, for those of us who lived through the 60s and saw movements for civil rights, equality, people suffered great hardship during that period. We know there were bombings of buses, of schools, of churches, etc. So sacrifice for the higher good can be indicated. Heroic devotion to truth and justice are some higher interpretations. Ebbing of the life forces, we can see them dropping both from the grapes and the coins representing energy falling out of his hands. We might interpret this as disappointments, wasted effort, sacrifice, or expiation. It can represent self-destruction, whether it's, what do they say? Insanity is
Doing the same thing over and over again that hasn't worked before.
and expecting different results. So it can be any self-destructive habit. It corresponds in the Hermetic system to the sign of Pisces, which we know governs the 12th house and is considered to be the department in a chart of self-undoing. But it is also the area of a chart which has to do with one's inner life and explorations into inner space, as well as compassion. It governs things such as hospitals and charitable causes, places of retreat, as well as prisons. So it's different types of confinement.
Patient with a, limited situation. I often associate patience with the kind of having to put up with something until it can move.
Yes, and I don't know if putting up with something is always necessarily patience, but
Having to accept something. Something may
acceptance,
take a while.
yes.
It doesn't feel like it's allowing us freedom.
Right, and we all have difficulties with impulses, and when we want change, we want it to happen now, and there are many natural processes that take a long time, and the process of initiation alone is something that takes a long time. Oftentimes in our tradition here, as people start to study the courses, you'll get students that want to do 7 courses at a time. Because they're trained in the concept of school or the university, where you just get the test done in order to get the paper or the diploma or the award at the end. Whereas the process of initiation is all about developing ability and developing skill. And many things that are skills are not really developed through passing a test. They're actually developed through the careful application of the subject matter.
I once read that the body is similar to the alchemical symbol for sulfur. And I don't know what that symbol looks like, and I'm not sure what sulfur would represent. Would that apply in your mind to
I'll have to
the
think
meaning of
about
this
that,
card?
since I'm not calling to mind the symbol for sulfur.
I
But sulfur
don't know.
in alchemy represents spirit, the element of spirit.
And it's transformative, isn't it?
It is, because it can ignite. So, to some degree, our selflessness and sacrifice for the higher good oftentimes is what ignites change.
Well,
But
also-
in the process, oftentimes one is lost in the process. There's collateral damage, as they say.
And with his feet planted in heaven, for going along with spirit, I sometimes associate it with that kind of transcendence where meditation and developing
Right.
inner life.
If the card is reversed, you suddenly have him doing this yoga pose, and the money's falling into his hands. So, again, it can show the energies moving a different direction. That, in that case, the sacrifice may actually bring good to the individual. All right. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Self-sacrifice is the real miracle out of which all the reported miracles grow. So we've looked at this card in detail. This comes from the Crowley deck, which is very bold. What's interested in this deck, although he's hanging from one foot, the arms are not forming the same pattern here. It is now forming a trine moving upwards. And what's interesting is, much like the image of the crucified Christ, we can see he's nailed.
Those aren't Sephiroth, are they?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sephiroth? Or the...
Oh, out of the Kabbalah, the Sephiroth?
It could be. It could be that somewhere, I don't know if this is designed on the Tree of Life, where we may actually be looking at specific Sephiroth, since they are done as spheres. You know, that is possible. There may be a formula that was
They don't line up perfectly, but it could be
entered in this.
because the person would look very strange if they were lined up perfectly.
Right, and there aren't 10 here. We can certainly see 5 out of 10, but even that may tell a certain story depending on their position on the Tree of Life.
The upside down Ankh is
Yes.
about as disturbing as an upside down cross.
Right. And again, you flip it over and it's ta-da!
Uh-huh.
You know, it's not the ebbing of the life force when it's reversed. It's the joyous expression of the life force. This, again, is from a Dur woodcut. Wonderfully done, where we see 2 trees creating this scaffold from which he hangs.
What's La Peso mean?
That the hanging man,
Okay.
or it would actually be the hanged one, La Peso.
I sometimes interpret the card as meaning hung up, something that's hanging us up. So they're in our vernacular.
You know, it's a perfect interpretation for that. And here's another more contemporary image of that in this beautiful watercolor. Here, curiously, the legs are not crossed, so there's different symbolism going on in the body language. The legs are open here, and the hands are tied up behind rather than below, but still, from his head are falling these coins. Arcanum 13 is called the Reaper, but more often than not, it's called Death. And a question, Barbara.
Oh, I think on the last one, symbol for sulfur is a cross under a triangle.
Okay, so if it's reversed, at least in this card, you have the cross and the triangle.
The cross one bears.
So that too would be the reversed symbol of soul.
Mhm.
Right.
Now, in the speaking of reverse cards, in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, we see each card as representing a specific type of energy. Basically, a vibration, a frequency, you might call it. And that frequency has the potential for positive and negative traits. When the card is right side up, we consider it to be more powerful. When reversed, we don't generally create an alternative meaning. It just shows lesser energy. But there are a couple of cards, Arcanum 12 and 22, are 2 cards whose meanings are definitely altered by reversal in a reading. So, why would they call this card Death? Main feature here is a skeleton. which is a universal symbol for death. He holds a scythe, this sort of lunar-shaped cutting instrument, which is used for mowing grasses and grains. Only he is cutting down the heads, hands, and feet of individuals. The movement of the scythe is much like the movement of the moon, which changes every night in the heavens in terms of shape and placement. So the swinging of the scythe represents the passage of time in the hands of the reaper. I don't call him the Grim Reaper because I actually think he's smiling. The heads represent our thoughts, the hands are works, and the feet are understanding, which in time, all of that passes. I mean, has anyone here ever held an opinion strongly and some years later you thought about that topic entirely differently based on your experiences or increased knowledge or understanding you gained? So we know that our works, many of the incredible artifacts of the world have been destroyed where they are in moister climates. For example, down in Central America, most of the wooden artifacts have disappeared just because of rot alone. In Egypt, where we have 6,000 plus year old pyramids, they've even been eroded by wind and little bits of rain and sand, but by human hands. So in time, our works disappear from the face of the earth and our understandings. So this card can represent death. But death is not just the dissolution of the physical body. Death can be symbolic in the form of transformation, dying from one form to another. It's the perpetual movement of creation, destruction, and renewal. Here, renewal is symbolized by the rainbow, which is the symbol of hope. In the biblical story of Noah, after the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, much like we've had recently, the great deluge, God granted a rainbow as a symbol of the covenant that he made with humans. I like this. The universe reabsorbs without ceasing. You know, if you think you were Nefertiti in your previous life, who knows? You may actually have an atom of Nefertiti in your body because we're in one big recycling machine. It's like one of those compost balls that people roll around their yards. This card corresponds to the first sign of the zodiac, which is Aries. So in order for the year to end and begin anew, something has to die. And the qualities of Aries have to do with leadership and officiousness or bossiness. They tend to be assertive, aggressive, combative, and competitive. Sherry Moraga said, she's a Chicana playwright, sometimes a breakdown can be the beginning of a kind of breakthrough, a way of living in advance through a trauma that prepares you for a future of radical transformation. I like that one for Arcanum 13. This is classic from the Waite deck. This is a very medieval look and comes actually out of an art form which became very popular during medieval times, which was called the Ars Mori, or the art of death. Keep in mind that during these... Yikes. I think I just readjusted the screen.
Space and time kind of blurred for a minute.
Yeah. During medieval and Renaissance times, and even in the last century during the teens, when we had the outbreak of Spanish flu, and in the 80s with the advance of AIDS, there have been pandemics that have hit. During medieval Renaissance times, it was the primary plague was bubonic. And so there were periods where we don't necessarily know about other parts of the world, what was going on with populations in Africa or Asia. But in Europe, there were times when populations were decimated by 1/3. 3+ out of every 10 people in your family dying, all within a brief period of time. So it truly brought forward this incredible level of awareness of the presence of death, and death as the most democratic institution. It knocks down everyone alike. And there was this whole art form that developed around it, known as the Ars Mori, and sometimes called the Danse Macabre. And I thought this was a wonderful image from this Russian lacquerware deck, where you can really see the terrors of war going on in here, death and destruction through human means.
You can almost hear the swords going. Looks a little Darth Vader-ish, doesn't it?
It does. Very Darth Vader-ish. Now I get what the sound effects were. They were lost on me for a moment.
Figured nobody laughed. I had to explain it further.
Thank you. And here's a wonderful old woodcut, the Death, and you can see the elements. Once when I was visiting in the village of Oppenheim in Germany, behind the cathedral there, they had what was called a Beinhaus, what we would call an ossuary. And it's where, good real estate like that you want to continue to use. So people would be buried. When the bodies decayed, the bones were dug up and placed in this mass memorial so that new bodies could be put in the earth. It wasn't quite forest long.
A bone pile is an ossuary.
Uh-huh.
Never knew the word.
Yeah, it's from the Latin. A good cognate in Spanish is huesos. So
They had
osos,
that still operative in Germany?
I don't know how recent or ancient it was, but it was still visible.
Wow.
Up until a couple of days ago, I've been driving around with no back window, and I almost got creamed going through an intersection. Somebody ran the red and just went so close to my car that I heard that whoosh noise,
Oh my God.
and I think the Reaper was right over my head.
Wow.
So that gave me pause. A little bit of adrenaline.
Yeah, we all have to, this card teaches us that we all have to live in the presence of death, because we just don't know when our card's going to be pulled, when our number's up, so to speak. Arcanum 14 is called the Alchemist, and I think it's called Temperance in other decks. And in the older manuscript that I described earlier of the outline of initiation. This card was called Rebirth. So we went from death to rebirth. And we can see here, this is a non-physical creature, not only from the color of the skin, it looks like someone who might visit Roswell, but it's got wings, which shows that it's not of this world. It is crowned with flame, again, to indicate the connection to spirit. It's got winged ankles, much like the god Mercury, the psychopomp has, who could pass between the realm of death and the physical realm. In his or her hands, because it's pictured differently in different decks, and some as feminine and others as masculine, this is looking fairly androgynous. A little bit of a 1920s hairdo. But there is a ewer of silver and one of gold, in which the vital forces of life, representing the masculine feminine force, are being exchanged between these two urns. So it's the card of regeneration, and regeneration could be mental, emotional, physical. The perpetual movement of life, exchange of masculine, feminine energies and forces, the more subtle forces of nature, the awareness of being both empty and full, when we spoke of the vessel before. And it corresponds astrologically to the sign of Taurus, which is considered to be both acquisitive, stable, stubborn, persevering. But most important with this card is Taurus represents the fertile or fecund life force. It's basically the dark soil in spring in which seed is planted. So this regeneration represents the qualities of spring, of life coming back into being. Pythagoras said, "If there be light, then there is darkness. If cold, heat. If height, depth. If solid, fluid. If hard, soft. If rough, smooth. If calm, tempest. If prosperity, adversity. If life, death." So this card of rebirth, we can see here in the Visconti Sforza deck that this is a feminine force. Curiously, standing at the edge of a cliff. But we can see the greening of the earth around her.
A lot of decks have one foot on land and one in water.
Mm-hmm. Similar to Arcanum 17.
Mm-hmm.
Here again, you see this pictured not so much as a genie in the Egyptian tradition, but an angel in Western medieval tradition.
There's one.
And in the Waite deck, yes, you can see on land and on water that earth and water make life.
Is the simple triangle an alchemical symbol?
For fire.
Uh-huh.
And it looks like there's the tetragrammaton on her chest. If I can read, it looks like it says Yod He Vav. No, it doesn't. I may be making that up. Looked like Hebrew writing.
Yeah.
Which it is. If you read Waite's book on, all that stuff's all over the place.
All right, Arcanum 15 is called the Black Magician. It's called Injustice. In most decks, it's called the Devil. Here we have a composite creature, body of a hog representing selfishness, wings of a bat, representing that it's a denizen of the darkness, head of a crocodile representing viciousness. You don't want to encounter this guy in a dark alley. And the flame, which is, it's non-physical. This terrifying beastie is not of this world. In one hand, he holds a flaming torch, and this scepter, which is a double cross of materialism. Here we see the downward position of the triangle, which we know shows direction. Something's being pulled down into matter. And what is it? It's the circle of spirit. So in a sense, black magic is basically just the reverse of ritual. Now, this isn't playing your Beatles records backwards in order to hear Satan speaking, but it is, and when ritual is inversed in some ways, or where it's used for purely selfish purposes, what's happened is two individuals, male and female, it's hard to tell from these images, with the heads of goats, are chained, that become enslaved by a force that they sought to control. And that represents the fate of those who use ceremony for purely personal gain. In many of the Tarot Arcanum, we've seen the serpent coming out of the brow, representing the reptilian mind reaching the level of enlightenment. But here it comes out of the realm of the solar plexus, which is the power chakra in the body. So again, it's representing that one's kundalini energy, their shakti, their divine force has stopped in a center of power. So this card can represent selfishness, greed, descending into the astral hells. Eastern Tibetan tradition talks about bodhisattvas, whose experience is about always reincarnating into the world to help humanity. And in Western traditions, in the New Testament, they talk about in that period of time when Jesus was in the grave, where he went down into hell to walk among those there. So there are stories of divine beings that oftentimes descend into realms to help others who are suffering. So this can also represent, from the, Jungian theories, our shadow side. This is a card of patience, because this is the card where you have to endure long periods of hardship that don't let up. If you have ever had a lasting illness and day after day of waking up feeling badly, it's something that can lead to depression, or in losing someone you love in an untimely way or in a way that seems unfair can have that same grinding effect on the psyche. This can represent the backlash of magic or ceremony if one does not properly know how to control forces that they're trying to work with. Depression. And it corresponds to Saturn, which governs the safety urges in the soul, which have to do with planning, foresight, self-preservation, but it's also considered the planet of avarice, grabbing what one can for oneself. And in response to that, Gandhi said, "There is a sufficiency in the world for man's need, but not for man's greed." So here in the weight deck, it's called the Devil, and you can see a more, again, a more medieval view. He has that really scary face. with the horns of a goat. Again, Saturn governs the sign of Capricorn. And so the goat was oftentimes used to represent that dark force. But here again, he also has the wings of a bat, unmistakably. He looks almost like a satyr with the goat's horns and the hairy lower body. And we have a naked man and woman with horns on their heads, chained to his pillar.
But the chains are loose enough so that if they wise up, they can lift them off themselves.
Well put. So we can lift our chains of bondage, the things that enslave us, our addictions. Here's another pretty gruesome image.
Now this card was shown to me to be like a different, almost the same exact picture as the lovers, but interpreted with different characters and telling a different story.
Interesting. It would be interesting to prepare that image because, yes, it's the same setup. Two individuals, a winged creature between them. One might show the power of relationship for good, joy, harmony, or I'm sure you've all known couples who have remained in relationships, but where they pour toxicity into one another, where you could not bear to visit them or be around them because of the ire and just poison that was present.
And the old ball and chain image of
Well,
marriage.
and here's another very different image. There's only two individuals featured here, whereas in the others there's these composite groupings of three. Here we just have a woman sorrowing as this gigantic creature hovers over her. All right, the lightning, also called destruction, and in many decks it is called the tower. A pyramid with many levels has been struck by lightning, and falling to their peril is both a commoner and an aristocrat, showing that we're all struck down alike. This is commonly read as accident or catastrophe, the chastisement of pride, passions that are unrestrained, that's uncontrolled impulses, the punishment which is attracted by those who use magical forces towards selfish needs, selfish ends. So this is the end result of the card prior to it. The need to develop impulse control. And in our deck, this card corresponds to Mars, which is the aggressive urges of the soul that expresses being assertive, combative, competitive, impulsive, passionate, constructive or destructive. Helen Keller. No loss by flood and lightning, no destruction of cities and temples by the hostile forces of nature, has deprived man of so many noble lives and impulses as those which his intolerance has destroyed.
It's also called the Tower of God in one deck.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Tower of Destruction or Tower of God.
And this wonderful contemporary deck, this is based on images of the Tower of Babel, which are actually based on a ziggurat, that is in Iraq. That is an amazing piece of ancient Islamic architecture. And here you have it, which is the house of God. And again, we have a medieval tower, two figures falling, and this lightning bolt striking it. And here's the version in the Russian deck, the falling tower. But all are these images of destruction going on, unbridled force. Fortunately, after those two darkies, those two dark images, we get the star, which I think is called the star in almost every deck, though the older manuscript on the outline of initiation described this as union or hope. And hope is represented here. We have a butterfly, which goes from pupil through chrysalis and finally emerges as a butterfly. The flowers representing the awakening of life. Now, much like Arcanum 14, there is something mirrored here, which on land and by sea, we have a gold and silver ewer, which are pouring into land and earth. Two triangles, as above, so below. And 7 states of consciousness that can be achieved. So, the interior light which illuminates the spirit. Truth, hope, and faith. Study the mysteries of true science. Self-conscious immortality. This corresponds astrologically to the sign Gemini, which is thought, versatility, it is changeable, and it is dual. And we can see that duality both in the two urns, which she pours earth into water and water into earth, and this being half on land and half on water, much like the duality of the twins. The key to immortality is first living a life worth remembering. I love that card from the old Renaissance deck. Simply dressed, just holding the star. And her gown is like the heavens with little starlights on it. From the Swiss deck, two very different types of ewers are being held. She's all on land, but pouring into water here. But we can still see the 7 stars. Better count them. Yeah, there's 7. And I believe there are also 7 stars here. In all of these, except for this deck, she is naked, representing that truth is visible for all to see. The moon in almost every deck, sometimes in the older manuscript called chaos or passion. And I definitely relate to the chaos quality of this card. Those light and dark triangles we saw here are now side by side. There's a light and dark dog or jackal, representing both friendly and servile minds, but also those which could be treacherous. The negative space between these triangles forms another triangle pulling downward to the lair of the scorpion. In other decks, they have a crayfish, a lobster, some other arthropod is pictured in different decks. So, the moon here is being obscured by clouds. And this is normally interpreted as a deception or false friends. It can speak to the experience known as the dark night of the soul, when we may be despairing or feel the absence of God's presence in our life, which was so beautifully spoke about by St. John of the Cross. The qualities of despair. It can represent the influence of unseen worlds or non-physical intelligences. I like this description, the abyss of the infinite. So, it's basically a card that tells us that things are not what they appear to be. And when somebody comes to you for a reading and this card comes up, they may not even have the correct information. Or they may be purposefully obfuscating a fact. This corresponds to the sign of Cancer, governed by the moon, which is moody, feeling, sensitive, hypersensitive, tenacious, and nurturing. It's a dark, brooding card, which Cancers can be, but they also have the bright, nurturing, familial qualities to them. But according to statistics, does anyone know where most crimes take place? In one's home. And they are perpetrated by family members. So this card represents the dark side of the moon. This is from Douglas Hofstadter. It turns out that an eerie type of chaos can lurk just behind a facade of order, and yet deep inside the chaos lurks an even eerier type of order. He's a physicist. I'm forgetting what deck this is. It's in my collection. It's a contemporary, from the 1980s, a contemporary European deck.
Looks like the Marseille deck.
Yeah, I think it's very closely based on the Tarot de Marseille. So you see the light dog, the dark dog. Instead of pyramids, we've got towers here. And this is looking more like a lobster than a scorpion. And here, I can't tell if that's a serpent or a path leading off into the distance. So, even in chaos, one can find an eerier type of order. And we can see a lot of similarities between these two. The towers are both square-shaped, much like the medieval Italian towers. Relatively light and dark dogs. Here the crayfish is coming up out of the pond. And again, there's a path leading back to this landscape.
They both have those paisley-shaped droplets.
Yes,
from
they're
the sort of sun-moon combo.
They're shaped a lot like the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. On these, here they are more like paisley, and one can only imagine them as dewdrops or essence of moonbeams.
I think I read somewhere, are they shaped like a yacht?
Yes. Yeah, not the first letter, the 10th letter, the yod.
First letter of the tetragram.
Yeah, the first letter of the tetragram. Yes. And this is wonderfully eerie. I love how the moon was rendered in this dark background here. And it truly has that feeling of eeriness to it.
Those look more like dewdrops, too.
Oh, right. Arcanum 19, called the Sun of Osiris, but in almost every deck, the Sun. Male and female in a circle of flowers representing a sacred union. Overhead, there's a straight line and a circle being penetrated, which represents zygote, or the union of masculine and feminine force. Symbol of life on her chest. So, this card is read as supreme joy, happiness, the fullness of life. Our ultimate happiness is in our relationship with the divine. It can inform us that our relationships with others reflect the relationship of our soul to God, and it can represent the ultimate union of soulmates. And this card corresponds in the Brotherhood of Light series to the sign Leo, which is willful, creative, prideful, dominating. It expresses with kindness, love, romance, and children. Interestingly, in some of the more contemporary decks, it's pictured as a child on the back of a horse. So there's a difference between the older models and some more contemporary models, but I think in the Visconti Sforza deck, it is pictured as a child as well. So some decks show the union of the parents, which leads to children. Other decks show the childlike state of happiness. This is from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It is in the compelling zest of high adventure and of victory and in creative action that man finds his supreme joys.
You wrote The Little Prince.
The Little Prince, yes. So much like there were moonbeams before, this has these radiant energies coming out. And again, in astrology, the sun and moon are considered the most potent forces. We call them luminaries, and each has their own frequency or vibration that they express. Here, it looks like two children together, exploring their joys. Here, they're a little bit older, perhaps adolescent, because it looks like she has breasts. And here they're rising out of something, and they have a sort of a sacrificial altar between them. But the sun is definitely a dominant feature in each of these cards. We're going to go a few minutes over our time. I hope that's okay with everyone. Only because we started so late because of our technical problems. Arcanum 20, the Sarcophagus, which is the card of immortality. It's oftentimes read as the Last Judgment, or sometimes just called Judgment. Here we see a sarcophagus, which is rectangular, box-like, representing again the soul's involution into matter. And here the soul is now evolving back to spirit. There's mother, father, child. So a family unit being heralded forth by the genie of the moon. And these look a little like ladybugs, but I think they're scarabs, which was the symbol of resurrection.
Scarab was associated with the sun, right?
Yeah. Though this card is associated with the moon. I mean, this may be the sun in the corner. We can't really tell. But the scarabs were always pictured as pushing this solar disk, which was actually the dung ball in which they would lay their eggs, which would then feast on the organic matter and grow within that. So this card can represent ascension into higher realms, that immortality has been achieved. One may experience an unexpected elevation. In some cases, this card can speak of the next life. Insight and compassion helps liberate others from their cravings. Also, I like the concept as we evolve, others evolve. As our frequencies change, everyone around us, their frequencies begin to change. The moon is considered to be the planet of nesting and nurturing, of family, of domesticity, of intuition and growth. The previous card called the moon shows more of the dark side of the moon, and this card represents more of the positive traits of the lunar energy and the sign Cancer. Odd character to use, but I did love his quote, William Jennings Bryant. If this invisible germ of life in the grain of wheat can thus pass unimpaired through 3,000 resurrections, I shall not doubt that my soul has power to clothe itself with a body suited to its new existence when this earthly frame has crumbled into dust. Here, this is from, I guess this may not be, no, this does come from Endura. Il giudizio, the judgment. So here you see several sarcophagi opening and releasing their occupants. Here again, there are 3 figures. It's hard to tell from the backside if that's male or female, but that could be the father, mother, child, and the angel of judgment heralding them on. And those are some Nalgas there too. That's some good butt showing here. So. I guess that's why they call it mooning. So. All right. The last of the major Arcanum, 21. Is the adept, spoken of in the older manuscript as the rhythm of life, and in most texts it's called the world, or the universe. We have a woman, simply clothed, playing on a lyra of 3 strings, showing that she knows how to impact vibrations in all 3 realms, physical, astral, spiritual. We see the Masonic symbols, to know, to do, to dare, to be silent, which represent the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac.
Again?
To know, to do, to dare, to be silent. Why in that order? I don't know. We're told by Zhang that this personal appliance-looking object is a winged lingam. So it represents sexual energies that have been elevated to a spiritual level, vital life force that's been used towards one's spiritual attainment. This card represents success, achievement, enlightenment, the mastery of self. Cosmic consciousness is attained. Vast perceptions on all levels. Love and wisdom guide our actions. And it corresponds astrologically to the sun, which represents power, authority, success, leadership, and recognition. All right, Henry David Thoreau. If one advances confidently in the direction of one's dreams and endeavors to live the life which one has imagined, one will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. image is very different here, though we see the man, the eagle, the lion, and the bull, different order. This wreath of flowers has been extended out to circle the woman, the symbol of attainment. It becomes a laurel wreath, which is what the Greeks offered to the Olympiads for their accomplishments. And in this Swiss deck, it's similar. I believe the woman takes on the role of the man. We have the eagle, the bull, and lion, and a floral wreath around her. And she's wearing fewer clothing items than these two. We can see here she shops at the same boutique. We've got the man, the eagle, the lion, and the bull. Same order as here.
Her batons are interesting, aren't they?
Yeah, they are very interesting. The fact that she has two. We see one here, none here. She holds the lyra. So we'll end with this. The other information I was going to give tonight, which is in your notes, I'll include that in next week's class.
Thank you. Wonderful.
You're welcome.